Good afternoon and welcome to an ITV News special programme on the country's new Prime Minister. Theresa May's 3 years in the top job in politics has just minutes left. Boris Johnson's is about to begin. We'll bring you all the key moments as we follow the handover of power from the 76th Prime Minister to the 77th. We'll be live in Downing Street for Theresa May's departure. Expect that and a speech from her in around 20 minutes' time or so. We'll then watch as she makes her final journey as Prime Minister to the palace for that meeting with the Queen to recommend Mr Johnson takes the helm. Our political and royal editors, Robert Peston and Chris Shipp, will be with me all afternoon with the detail, the updates and analysis of Prime Minister Johnson Day 1. And Libby Vina will be getting reaction from politicians at Westminster. We'll also have teams across the UK, in Europe and in the United States poised to react to what is likely to be an unpredictable afternoon. First, let's take you straight to Downing Street and straight to Robert Peston. Robert, you're going to be bringing us all the comings and goings, watching that black door behind you very carefully for the next few hours.
That's exactly right. It's a momentous day for Boris Johnson, a momentous day for us in this country, because on day one of being a Prime Minister, that is when the person who moves into 10 Downing Street has maximum power. It's the only moment when a new Prime Minister can completely make a cabinet team a team of officials. And this is the moment when the Prime Minister has to work out who does he trust, who is he going to need. Now, Boris Johnson has decided, and I think many people would agree with him, that we're in a national emergency. He says it's absolutely imperative to get us out of the EU by the 31st of October. It was almost his, well, it certainly was his most important policy when he was campaigning to become leader. Some would say it was his only genuinely hard commitment. But it won't be easy, because the kind of things he wants from the EU to get a deal, well, the EU is signaling they're not going to give to him. He wants to rip up the Prime Minister's agreement, the withdrawal agreement. He wants to rip up the backstop, that arrangement which is designed to keep the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic open. They've said they're not going to do any of that. So his default position is we're going to leave without a deal at the end of October. But there are plenty of MPs, including in his own party, who want to stop that. So somehow he's got to drive this Brexit through. And for me, the most important appointment he's made today is of a man called Dominic Cummings. And the point about that appointment is Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings worked closely together back in 2016 on that Vote Leave campaign, which won the day, which won the referendum, but has not yet been translated into actual Brexit. Dominic Cummings, one of the most determined individuals I've ever come across. He will be driving Boris Johnson's government alongside Boris Johnson.
Yeah, he's one of the people behind the scenes in Boris Johnson's premiership. What about the speculation that's already rife about the top 3 political jobs in cabinet?
So we are going to hear in the course of the day the probably 6 appointments, 6 cabinet appointments. I'm expecting Sajid Javid, the current Home Secretary, to become Chancellor. It is probable that Priti Patel will be Home Secretary. I said on the 10 o'clock news last night that she is going to rejoin the cabinet. She was a big figure in the Vote Leave campaign, an ardent Brexiter. Very uncertain at the moment who's going to be Foreign Secretary. Boris Johnson wants Jeremy Hunt to move to a different job. Jeremy Hunt has said no. So there's this massive standoff between Boris Johnson and the man he only recently defeated in that leadership election. All very tense.
Yep, it is indeed, Robert. For now, thank you very much. It'll be some time yet before we know who is in Boris Johnson's cabinet, of course. The Queen's first Prime Minister was Sir Winston Churchill. Boris Johnson will be her 14th. He has, of course, long admired Churchill and, just like him, comes to office without a general election. Our royal editor, Chris Shipp, is outside Buckingham Palace. We'll come to Boris Johnson in good time, but the Queen's first appointment is with the outgoing Prime Minister, Theresa May. Talk us through how these goodbyes usually play out, Chris.
Well, it's a tried and tested sequence of events, and the Queen, as you rightly say, has done it a number of times before. Now, whilst Boris Johnson will be the 14th Prime Minister for Her Majesty the Queen, she's actually done this changeover 15 times, because Harold Wilson was elected both in 1964 and 74. So the Queen's been here a few times before. One thing she hasn't had that often, though, Nina, is a female Prime Minister. This is only her second ever female Prime Minister. And I think most people inside the palace will tell you that the Queen has looked forward to her weekly meetings with Theresa May. And actually, I can say from experience, and I've heard some members of the royal family express their admiration for what Theresa May has done. They are, of course, politically neutral, and without deviating from that political neutrality at all, I think they acknowledge how hard she has worked. So she'll be the first in through the North Centre gate behind me, and that's where she will then have her audience with the Queen and tender her resignation.
Not long to wait now for that, Chris Shipp. We'll return to you in due time. Thank you very much. Even before Mrs May has officially left Downing Street, the resignations have begun. Philip Hammond has stepped down as Chancellor. The former Tory leadership candidate, Rory Stewart, has gone as International Development Secretary. And David Gork, he has fulfilled his promise to resign today as Justice Secretary. All three oppose Boris Johnson's willingness to leave the EU without a deal. Well, just over an hour ago, Theresa May left the House of Commons after her final Prime Minister's questions and was seen off with a customary standing ovation. If you take a close look, it was mainly the government benches clapping Mrs May out. Well, many Labour and all the SNP MPs sat unmoved. That's perhaps no surprise, as her final exchanges with the leader of the opposition were as bitter and combative as ever.
At every stage, his only interest has been playing party politics. And frankly, he should be ashamed of himself.
I hope, Mr. Speaker, that she has a marginally more relaxing time on the backbenches, and perhaps, like the Chancellor, even helping me to oppose the reckless plans of her successor.
As a party leader who has accepted when her time was up, perhaps the time is now for him to do the same.
Our political correspondent Paul Brand is in the Houses of Parliament. Theresa May's husband was watching that pretty short-tempered last PMQs for Mrs May. What is the mood among MPs on all sides of the House?
Yeah, Nina, I think it would have been a little bit much to expect Jeremy Corbyn to pay tribute to a record he spent the past 3 years opposing. But aside from that face-to-face, at least Theresa May could look behind her back and see that standing ovation for the first time in a long while. Conservative MPs applauding her on her way out, a little bit rich from some, you might say. And aside from all the nerves here in Westminster today, I think there are two feelings among MPs, really. Firstly, one of relief. You know, it has been the case in the past year that those who shout loudest tend to be heard, but there are a lot of quiet Conservatives who felt deeply uncomfortable watching Theresa May take blow after blow. One cabinet member said to me this week, finally the pain is over. And secondly, of course, there is real excitement on the Brexit supporting benches in the Commons. One Brexit supporting MP said to me today, we are now in control. And certainly looking at the likely cabinet lineup, I think that's true, that they may find they're in government but not in power. The arithmetic here doesn't change, and that rebel Remainer alliance is already amassing on the backbenches.
Paul Brand, thank you. OK, it's just a few minutes until Theresa May is scheduled to walk out of number 10 for the last time. We'll bring you that in a few minutes. Keep an eye on the clock. Welcome back to this ITV News special programme to see in the country's new Prime Minister. We are just a few minutes away from Theresa May walking out of that door as Prime Minister for the final time before she heads off, leaving Downing Street to see the Queen, to tender her resignation. We will follow events there and at Buckingham Palace as they unfold. Here with me in the studio for the duration is Dr. Catherine Haddon from the Institute for Government, who knows more about the process of becoming Prime Minister than pretty much anyone else in the country. Thank you for joining me on this, what will be a historic day. Look, Boris Johnson is in touching distance of getting his dream job. That moment, presumably he has imagined for some time, many years potentially. From your work, what do the likes of Tony Blair and Margaret Thatcher, how did they say that moment felt to them when the reality hit that they were the Prime Minister?
I mean, Tony Blair talked about a sort of almost sense of fear, that it was this sort of, suddenly daunting prospect. And likewise, Margaret Thatcher, she said it was actually very lonely, that final trip to the palace. They've waited so long, campaigned hard to try and get that job. Finally, it's there, and then it's just you sort of, heading up into the car. There might be other people with you. There's obviously a driver, but nonetheless, it's that suddenly that enormous weight is on your shoulders. So it's a very daunting prospect.
And we must just focus on the outgoing Prime Minister as well. A difficult journey for anybody, but especially somebody who will be deemed in the future, presumably, as not fulfilling the one thing she set out to fulfil, which was to complete Brexit. Absolutely,
but let's remember, very few Prime Ministers leave office thinking they've achieved everything that they can achieve and, they're satisfied with what they've done. Even Churchill, when he finally stood down, it was after much pressure from his party. So many Prime Ministers leave office. Gordon Brown, when he went 3 years in office, he no doubt had wanted to do so much more, wanted to stay so much longer. So it's hard on her. I think she'll feel that the next few months will really cement what her legacy is. Was Brexit just that stage too far? How much was it her? How much was it her party? So that legacy, in a sense, is still up for play. OK,
Catherine, for now, thank you. The world's media there camped outside Downing Street, watching and waiting for that door to open on number 10 for Theresa May to emerge. While we wait for her to do that, let's go to Libby in Westminster, who has some guests with her this afternoon. Libby.
Yes, Nina. Well, I think Brexit was meant to heal wounds in the Tory party over Europe. And I think most people observing the last 3 years would say that the party had failed in that. The big question now, can Boris Johnson actually unite the party? I'm joined by Grant Shapps, her former chairman, and Liz Truss, who has been Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Now, Liz Truss, you are a very prominent supporter of Boris Johnson in this campaign. Is he the man who can really bring the party back together?
Absolutely. He's got the energy, but also the optimism, I believe, not just to bring the party together, but also to enliven the country and get the country behind our national project, which is leaving by the 31st of October, but also doing all we need to do to level up the country, to help cities like Leeds and Manchester get better infrastructure. So I think he will inspire people. He will inspire people.
Appointing Dominic Cummings, who was the mastermind of the Vote Leave campaign, he's not liked by many MPs, and that is a feeling that is mutual. He doesn't like many MPs. Is that really going to work?
Well, I like Dominic Cummings, and I worked with Dominic Cummings when I was at the Department of Education. He's a very effective individual, and that's what we need. We need people who are effective at doing the job. We've got a massive task ahead of us, and my view is we need all the good players on the pitch, and that's very much Boris's approach.
Grant Shapps, is he possibly on the pitch because Boris Johnson is thinking ahead to a general election?
I wouldn't have thought so. I mean, most of viewers will have no idea who we're talking about, this Dominic Cummings guy, unless they have happened to have watched the Brexit movie. Actually, what more people are interested in is how's Boris going to go about running the country when he becomes Prime Minister later today, and of course the big issue, which is Brexit itself. I have no idea. I wouldn't read into tea leaves what one individual appointment of a non-politician means. What I do think with Boris is that, as Liz is saying, somebody who's actually going to energise the country again. And a lot of people say, oh, it wouldn't make any difference. Whoever been Prime Minister this last few years, we'd just end up here. That's like saying if you have a failing school in your constituency, Ofsted are called in,
you get a superhead, a change of leadership, and actually within 2 or 3 years they usually turn things around. A country's the same. It's not about changing the pupils, it's about changing the direction of travel. And I think, Dominic or anyone else coming in is really about re-energising a team in Downing Street.
Liz Truss, you make a lot of being good at maths. The maths in the House of Commons...
Are you going to give me a test now, Libby?
The maths in the House of Commons hasn't changed. It may get worse for Boris Johnson. You can talk all you like about energy and optimism, but how is he actually going to get a deal, if he wants a deal, through Parliament?
Well, first of all, he's very clear about the 31st of October. I think the problem we've had hitherto is the deadline hasn't been hard and fast. The current Prime Minister asked for an extension, so the opportunity for that time pressure was lost. And what we know about the EU is they generally do things at the last minute. It's 2 in the morning, there's a late night negotiation. And Boris, I believe, will stick to the 31st of October. He said it's do or die. I think that is what will make the EU move and make it much more likely that we will get a deal. And as Grant says, he's got the ability to communicate with the country, to bring people on side. And people in Britain are desperate for this issue to be sorted out. People are fed up of the limbo. Businesses want to know what's going to happen next. They want to be able to invest with certainty.
Sorry to interrupt. There is so little time. The idea of just threatening that we're going to leave without a deal will suddenly miraculously change things. Will it?
I don't agree there is so little time. We've already had 3 years. Pretty much every issue under the sun with respect to Brexit has been discussed at length with the EU. We now need to get to a decision point. We need to get to a crunch point, and that requires a deadline.
Well, I'll give you one.
Just briefly,
yeah, I'll give you one very practical example. We were passing, like every single day, dozens, hundreds of different what are called statutory instruments, secondary legislation designed to get us ready for Brexit. We've stopped passing that because it's been done now. So the country has prepared its laws if we leave. We have to prepare in a way where if we do have to leave without a deal, the country's ready for it, even though that's not the preference. And the difference with Boris is he'll look like he's serious whilst he's doing that, because he is serious.
Liz Truss, Grant Shapps, thanks very much.
Libby, thank you. Let's get you back to Downing Street. We're hearing that Theresa May is running a little bit behind schedule, perhaps a couple of minutes late to depart from Number 10 to come to the lectern and make her final speech as departing Prime Minister. We heard there from Grant Shapps and Liz Truss saying that Boris Johnson, the new Prime Minister, will be the person to unite not only the party but the country. Robert Peston, he's got a task on his hands, isn't he? If we think just in terms of the cabinet, a real balancing act between Remain MPs, between Brexit MPs, this issue of diversity balance, gender and ethnicity, and also needing some real experience, some grown-ups, and he's got to try and reward loyalty as well.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, we were just listening to Grant Shapps and Liz Truss, both of whom are auditioning for big jobs in Boris Johnson's cabinet. They were both great cheerleaders for Boris Johnson. So when they say the party's united, you have to take with that a little bit of a pinch of salt. We've had a number of resignations today from Theresa May's cabinet, from individuals like David Lidington, just gone, Rory Stewart, David Gauke, Philip Hammond, all of whom deeply critical of Boris Johnson's commitment that do or die, in his words, we will be leaving the EU on the 31st of October because they think that more or less commits him to a no-deal Brexit, and they think that would be very damaging to our prosperity and also very damaging to our security. So you are absolutely right that one of the biggest challenges Boris Johnson will face is simply keeping his party together and avoiding a vote of no confidence that could see him forced before he's ready into a general election. Now, last night, sources close to Boris Johnson told me that he does, however, want to present what he sees as a modern face to the country in respect of the composition of his cabinet. So he says, or he's indicated to me, that there will be more women in the cabinet as full cabinet members than Theresa May had. Now, I have to say, it's not a very tall order because she's only got 5 full members of the cabinet who are women out of 23, so he only needs to get 6. And that's still, you know, more or less a quarter to beat her record. It'll be interesting to see if he does much better than that. He also has said, or indicated, excuse me, that he's going to promote ethnic minorities. We expect Priti Patel, for example, to have a very senior job, possibly Home Secretary, as I've already mentioned to you. Ashok Sharma, who's currently the Employment Minister, likely to get a cabinet job. So he wants to show, despite the fact that he is an old Etonian, you know, educated at that privileged fee-paying school, also went to Oxford, he wants to show that the Tory party is not just a party of privilege, but a party, in his view, that he thinks can be seen to represent everybody.
Robert, what will we learn about Boris Johnson, Prime Minister Johnson, over what decision he makes over Jeremy Hunt? Will he survive as Foreign Secretary?
So there is this standoff at the moment. Boris Johnson very keen that the top jobs, including Foreign Secretary, are occupied by people he feels are deeply loyal to him and deeply committed to getting us out of the EU on the 31st of October. Jeremy Hunt indicated in his leadership campaign that he wasn't wedded to that date. I think there is a reasonable chance that Jeremy Hunt is returning to the backbenches. I think equally important will be what Boris Johnson says when he speaks in front of 10 Downing Street. You can see the lectern is there at the moment for Theresa May, but after 4 o'clock, Boris Johnson will be at that lectern. Now, one of the things I have learned today is that with what's known as the Vote Leave takeover of 10 Downing Street, the campaign chairman of Vote Leave going into 10 Downing Street is effectively Boris Johnson's chief executive. One of the priorities that Boris Johnson will be setting out is getting a load of extra money into the health service. You will remember that the most controversial, but some would say vote-winning promise that the Leave campaign made was that £350 million a week for the NHS on the side of the bus. Dominic Cummings and... Sorry, what's happening? Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson both regard it as a point of honour to deliver on that pledge of more money for the National Health Service.
Look, we're ever watchful of that door opening behind you. A few stirrings down there on Downing Street. We're getting the sense it's 2:25. Here we go. There's some people heading out there. Further down the street, there's Theresa May's staff, Gavin Barwell there, departing. Robert, what are we doing timing-wise here? Do you think this now is imminent? Her cheerleaders have left the building. Are we just a minute away from her emerging?
We are literally almost there. As you can, I hope, see on your screens, we have got a whole array of officials loyal to Theresa May, who've worked for her for ages, waiting for her, and here she comes now for her final words.
I'm about to go to Buckingham Palace to tender my resignation to Her Majesty the Queen and to advise her to ask Boris Johnson to form a new administration. I repeat my warm congratulations to Boris on winning the Conservative leadership election. I wish him and the government he will lead every good fortune in the months and years ahead. Their successes will be our country's successes, and I hope that they will be many. Their achievements will build on the work of nearly a decade of Conservative or Conservative-led government. During that time, our economy has been restored, our public services reformed, and our values defended on the world stage. Of course, much remains to be done. The immediate priority being to complete our exit from the European Union in a way that works for the whole United Kingdom. With success in that task can come a new beginning for our country, a national renewal that can move us beyond the current impasse into the bright future the British people deserve. To serve as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is the greatest honour. The heavy responsibilities are outweighed by the huge potential to serve your country. But you achieve nothing alone. And as I leave Downing Street, my final words are of sincere thanks. To my colleagues in government and parliament, to everyone in the building behind me and across the civil service, to the men and women of our armed forces and security services, and to the public servants in our schools, our NHS, our police and the other emergency services. All are inspired by the noble wish to serve their country in the national interest. I also want to thank the British people, everyone who loves our great country, who works hard for their family and wants their children and grandchildren to enjoy greater opportunity than they did. Thank you for putting your faith in me and giving me the chance to serve. This is a country of aspiration and opportunity. And I hope that every young girl who has seen a woman Prime Minister now knows for sure that there are no limits to what they can achieve. Finally, and most of all, I want to thank my husband, Philip, who's been my greatest supporter and my closest companion.
That wasn't me.
I think the answer to that is, I think not. I'm about to leave Downing Street, but I'm proud to continue as the Member of Parliament for Maidenhead. I will continue to do all I can to serve the national interest and play my part in making our United Kingdom a great country with a great future, a country that truly works for everyone.
Warm applause there from her team as she gets the final applause as Prime Minister as she walks now to the car to make that final journey to the palace for that meeting with the Queen, talking there of, as she said before, serving as PM, the greatest honour, and an off-the-cuff moment there, stop Brexit, a heckler says, I think not. Robert Peston, no surprises in that speech and no real emotional moments from Theresa May there.
And yes, deeply emotional moment for the Prime Minister. She kept it all pretty general. She said she wanted to thank the British people for putting their faith in her. And perhaps the most touching moment was when she said that she hoped that any young girl who'd seen her as a woman Prime Minister would realise that for every woman in this country, she thinks there are now no limits to what you can achieve. And of course, she gave a big thank you to the person who has been with her through thick and thin. Actually, one of the most self-deprecating spouses I've ever encountered, and that is her husband, Philip May. And what I have to say is been very striking about that relationship is, you know, in all the tough times, she would constantly lean on her husband for support. You know, you would see them together and, you know, he would be looking anxiously over at her just to check that she was okay. This was very much a double act.
Robert Peston, thank you. The car making its way past Trafalgar Square there, just heading onto the Mall and heading to Downing Street. We'll join our royal editor, Chris Shipp. Any sense as she heads to the Queen for that final meeting? Any sense of their real relationship that they have formed with those weekly meetings, the two very powerful women in this country over that 3-year period, Chris?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's always hard. They are private audiences of the Queen, and therefore we're never told exactly what happens. But you do get some sort of reports about how those meetings have gone. And I think the Queen has genuinely looked forward to those meetings that she's had, those weekly audiences that she's had with Theresa May. And as you rightly say, for a young woman, as the Queen was in 1952 when she extended the throne, I think she would have felt it difficult not to welcome the second Prime Minister of her reign. Now, I can just hear the motorbikes that are coming down this end of the Mall, so welcome to the other side of St James's Park now, and just behind me they're stopping the traffic to go round the Queen Victoria monument, and that's when Theresa May will have her final audience with the Queen as Prime Minister. So you can see her coming down now. Here the police motorbikes just stopping all the traffic. And this is, I suspect, a rather emotional moment for Theresa May. She's done this a number of times as Prime Minister over the last 3 years. I can see her car now just coming up behind us. And she will do this now for the last time before she tenders her resignation and invites the Queen to ask Boris Johnson to form a new administration.
Yeah, Chris, once that happens and she goes into Buckingham Palace, before he goes into Buckingham Palace, who is in charge of the country?
You know, that's a really interesting question, and we've debated that quite a lot. Now, for a start, this isn't the first time it's happened. If you think when Gordon Brown handed over to the coalition government to David Cameron, there was this little pause, this interregnum, if you like, between one Prime Minister and the next. So this particular Prime Minister is now going across the forecourt. She'll drive through the arch into the quadrangle. There she comes out into the centre of Buckingham Palace. And it's very interesting. The Queen must always have a Prime Minister, but from the moment Theresa May tenders hers and until Boris Johnson kisses hands on appointment, as it's known in old-fashioned speak, we technically don't have a Prime Minister. Does that mean the Queen's in charge? Well, I think it probably means the civil service is in charge, and there's still the civil service. It's always there, unstintingly there, whatever colour the government, whatever type of Prime Minister. So I'd say my answer to that very difficult question, Nina, is probably the civil service are in charge from that moment on.
There she goes. She's left the car, flanked once again by her husband, Philip May, there, heading into meeting the Queen for that, what we presume will be a relatively short meeting, a farewell meeting. We're going to leave it there just for now. We're going to take just a very short break, but we will be back in a few minutes' time when we'll see Boris Johnson making a very similar trip to the one Theresa May Welcome back. So the process, the procedure, the theatre of the handover, the transition of power between one Prime Minister to the next has happened. Theresa May is right now in that meeting with the Queen at Buckingham Palace. So while that is happening, we can speak to the former Cabinet Office Minister and friend of Theresa May, Damien Green, who joins me now from Westminster. Thank you for joining me today. Does Theresa May's legacy depend really on what Boris Johnson does next?
Not entirely. I think everyone knew that the getting a Brexit deal through was a hugely difficult task. It's proved an impossible task for Theresa, unfortunately. I hope and expect that Boris can achieve a deal, but I don't think her legacy depends entirely on that, not least because she has done a huge amount on the domestic front as well. Obviously, Brexit hasn't worked. Let's put that to one side.
Well, let's get back to Brexit. My point being, if he also fails, he's given himself a deadline of 99 days to get the UK out of the EU. If he doesn't manage that, will she then be judged differently in what she hasn't managed to do over a 3-year period?
No, I don't think that's how the world works. I think people will judge Boris on what he achieves as Prime Minister, just as they've judged Theresa. And actually, I think that the fact that Boris has made it so clear that October the 31st is a genuine deadline, that he's going to stick to it, will actually concentrate minds almost on both sides of the Channel, certainly in Brussels, so that everyone will know that they have, as you say, got 99 days. And since both sides want a deal, it seems to me that puts a lot of pressure on both sides actually to achieve that deal.
When she came to power, many were surprised about her opening speech at Downing Street, burning injustices, a different type of Theresa May than perhaps some people were expecting. There weren't really many surprises in her leaving speech. Do you agree with that analysis?
Well, I mean, a leading speech almost by definition hasn't got any surprises because she'll want to look back and reflect on her period in office. But you're right about the burning injustices, and that's why I think her domestic legacy on things like attacking modern slavery, on introducing effective measures against domestic violence, as well as the wider economic record of the lowest unemployment since the 1970s, is something she can look back on with genuine pride.
Did she speak to you about today, really? Obviously, we've been building up to this moment where she leaves Downing Street, where she is right now in that meeting with the Queen, about how, just on a human level, she would be feeling about what this day means to her and her regrets.
Well, Theresa's not a great one for discussing her private feelings with anyone except possibly Philip, a conversation I wouldn't be party to. But even if she did, I wouldn't repeat it on air. But I can imagine that she's feeling very flat. Who wouldn't in those circumstances? Most of us, there might be a mischievous part of the brain that thought some sort of sigh of relief that all the responsibilities of office have gone. But knowing Theresa, that proportion of her brain thinking relief will be much smaller than with most people, because I imagine, I'm sure, she will carry on working just as hard as she always has done, just that her focus will obviously be different as an ex-Prime Minister than it was as Prime Minister.
All right, Damien Green, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you. Catherine, so Theresa May, the first bit of the process of this handover of transition of power has begun. Let's turn to Boris Johnson then, because he is about to head into Buckingham Palace in the next hour or so himself. He will be the third Prime Minister in a decade to get the top job in politics without going through a general election. But actually, that's not as unusual as you think if you go back a few years.
No, if you go back to 1945, at least half of the Prime Ministers came into power this way, so it's not at all unusual in that sense. I think it's just at the moment, partly because there's a minority Conservative government, they've got this relationship with the Democratic Unionist Party, but still they didn't get a majority at the election. So a lot of people have been talking about, you know, the legitimacy of the takeover and so forth for that reason. But at the moment, he still seems to be the best place to command a majority. We will see in the coming days, depending on what he says, whether or not some of his own MPs talk about whether they would vote no confidence, whether that can hold up. But for the moment, it's perfectly normal in constitutional terms.
We're seeing pictures of Buckingham Palace there, Theresa May in there having that final meeting with the Queen. But if we focus on behind the scenes at Downing Street, what is going on right now? Because she's gone, her team have gone, we've seen them leave the building. The clapping out process, ceremony has happened. They're setting up for the clapping-in ceremony of Boris Johnson. Is it chaos in there? How difficult is it to turn that around so quickly?
Well, officials I've talked to have said it's quite a surreal time. I'm very emotional, yes. And Theresa May was supposedly very well liked in number 10 by the sort of permanent staff. You know, there would have been some tears, there would have been very emotional. But right now, yeah, they're really focused on getting ready for the new Prime Minister. We saw some of her own team coming out to watch her. The civil service will be trying to choreograph getting all of them and their stuff out of the building and then getting Boris Johnson's in so that all of his team are ready to go when he arrives back in that door. That's tricky in itself. There's 3 entrances. Sometimes they get it wrong. In 2016, apparently there was an awkward encounter in the corridor between the incoming and the outgoing team. So they'll be trying to get that right. You know, they'll be tidying. They'll be sort of trying to get briefing papers ready and get the right people in the building to greet him.
And all change for all of them. Personal feelings aside, politics aside, they've got to welcome in the new Prime Minister and whatever that entails, whatever that brings.
Absolutely. This is the point of a permanent civil service. They take on the new Prime Minister. They take on, you know, even a complete change in direction in policy. They had to do that in 2016 when we voted to leave the EU, turning to Brexit policy. They do it every general election as well. It's the first time for this Cabinet Secretary to do that. He was appointed after Theresa May came to power. But, you know, there are a lot of briefing papers, there's a lot of institutional memory, so hopefully they'll get all those sort of details right. But they don't always, but hopefully.
Catherine Haddon for now, thank you very much. Let's head back to Buckingham Palace and rejoin our royal editor, Chris Shipp. One of the hardest things, I think, must be, if you are in that position of being the outgoing Prime Minister, is this very logistical thing of you get out of that car, the lovely car that you arrive in, and you go into the palace and you leave and you don't get access to that car at any moment. The reality hitting that she is saying goodbye to Downing Street, to the job that she always wanted, and to all the trappings that come with being in that position of great power.
You know, that's absolutely right. We're told that Theresa May, who's either right now having her final audience with the Queen as Prime Minister or has just had her final audience with the Queen as Prime Minister, she will leave Buckingham Palace privately after inviting the Queen to ask Boris Johnson in to form a new administration. But, you know, Nina, I remember when Tony Blair stood down and he got the train up to near his constituency up in the northeast of England, and he got off the train and, as you say, got into a very normal-looking car and drove off to his constituency in Sedgefield. The trappings of Prime Minister fall away rather quickly, but as you rightly say, this is quite a mechanical operation, if you like. The Queen has been here, she's done it many times before, and again, it's not always after general elections, as you've just been talking about on a number of times in recent years, but also historically, Prime Ministers have been invited to the Buckingham Palace not after a general election, but after an appointment or a vote, the kind of which we've just had in the Conservative Party.
OK, Chris Shipp, thank you for now. Catherine, take us through, fast forward a bit to when Boris Johnson returns to Downing Street and after he's made that speech. We've seen some appointments already this morning in terms of behind-the-scenes staff. What's the process of appointing those cabinet positions in terms of when do you think we'll see the full team in place?
You're likely to start seeing the sort of first 6 maybe appointments this evening. It takes time though. They've got to, you know, informally inform the palace, make sure it's okay. There's often sort of checks that they need to do. There's inviting them in. It's all very carefully choreographed. Involves this sort of massive whiteboard that has all of the departments and all the spaces that they've got to fill. So you assume that he's done a lot of thinking about this, but all it takes is one of those early appointments going wrong, and then suddenly that has a knock-on effect throughout. So we don't know how quickly we'll hear the first one. You know, it could be sort of within an hour or two of him going back within those doors. But remember, there's all sorts of other stuff he's doing. He's going to get a phone call probably from, you know, heads of other countries, from the US president. He's going to be taking into briefings about the latest intelligence and defence issues. So there's loads of other things that are happening whilst he's trying to do that sort of massive HR process.
Yeah, a long afternoon ahead and evening for Prime Minister Johnson when he officially becomes that role. Catherine, thank you. Let's return to Downing Street then and rejoin Robert Peston. So Theresa May has gone. We're on the countdown now for Boris Johnson to then go to Buckingham Palace and then rejoin the melee there at Downing Street. What sort of comings and goings have you seen while Theresa May's been around the corner?
Well, nothing so far, but I think around sort of 3-ish we'll begin to see Boris Johnson's advisors wandering up Downing Street from the famous gates at the end into number 10. And obviously, in respect of the sort of human side of all of this, we're all interested to see whether his girlfriend, Carrie, turns up. We've been briefed that she is going to be living in 10 Downing Street, and I think plainly the photographers, of whom there are many here, will be desperate to get a snap of her for tomorrow's papers. The other thing which is obviously going to be terribly important is the speech, the address that Boris Johnson gives to the nation. The lectern's gone, but it'll be back out again sometime after 4 o'clock. He's already talked about his priorities. More police. He's talked about he wants broadband, fibre broadband in every home. One of the things I talked to you a bit about earlier, which he didn't talk about much in the campaign, is there's going to be a lot of more money going to the NHS. Infrastructure, road and rail. He's very, very keen on big investments in improving the nation's transport links. So there will be some meat in what he says this afternoon, because for him, although Brexit is his absolutely huge priority, one of the things that you and I have been talking about in recent days is there is for him significant risk that he will be forced to go to the country, forced to hold a general election if he wants his vision of Brexit through in the autumn. But he can't campaign in a general election just on delivering a no-deal Brexit. He's also got to prove that he's got other ideas for the country. So he's got to set to work on improving schools, improving the health service. The other area is obviously social care, care for the elderly. It's been one of the sort of millstones around Theresa May's neck that she's not managed to sort out this problem of how we fund the care of people as they get older. Again, another big priority for Boris Johnson.
Yeah, we often, journalists, don't we, judge Prime Ministers or examine their first 100 days in office. Justine Greening told ITV News yesterday he will be judged in the first 100 hours on that issue of Brexit. When are we going to learn what his big plan is?
So, he will start talking to European leaders almost immediately about what he wants, and he has said that he wants to rip up that backstop, that arrangement which keeps the border open between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, but importantly and controversially within the Tory party, would keep the whole of the UK in the customs union. Many Brexiters say that would give Brussels too much influence over the UK, and for Northern Ireland's DUP, Democratic Unionist Party, which props up the government, they hate the backstop because they think it will drive a wedge between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, because there will be different rules in Northern Ireland from Great Britain. But the EU says no deal, no withdrawal agreement without the backstop. So I think it is very likely that within a matter of weeks it'll be clear that what Boris Johnson refers to as his second best option, which is a no-deal Brexit, will become the primary option, the first option. At that point, there's going to be one hell of a battle in Parliament, because not only does the opposition Labour Party, the SNP, Plaid Cymru, the Greens all object to a no-deal Brexit. There are a significant number of Tory MPs, including the outgoing Chancellor Philip Hammond, who object to it. So it is going to be a tumultuous, a lively autumn.
Robert, thank you. Let's head back to Buckingham Palace and join Chris Shipp, who has a guest with him outside the palace now.
Yeah, hi Nina. So that meeting is going on. We're waiting for Boris Johnson, and we were talking about that sort of interregnum in between one Prime Minister resigning and the other kissing hands with the Queen on appointment. Anna Whitelock is with me, a royal historian. Anna, when we say kissing hands on appointment, does it actually happen, or is it a little bit more ceremonial than that?
Ceremonial, yes. I mean, it's more of an air kiss, a gesture really. Although the kissing happens tomorrow actually, when the Privy Council meet and when the new ministers of government do have to swear loyalty to the Queen and they get their seals of office. And at that point, they do kneel in front of the Queen and they do kiss her hand. But today it's much more of a gesture, but it's important. And of course, we have an unwritten constitution. It's all about tradition, and actually these things matter. And if we look back in history actually to 1908, when Asquith became Prime Minister, he had to go to France where Edward VII was on holiday just for the kissing of hands, literally to go do the air kiss, and then he jumped on the plane and came back again. So actually these things do matter.
There was actually some talk actually that because the Queen is actually staying at Windsor Castle at the moment, she might have summoned the Prime Minister down there. Turns out those newspaper reports were wrong, because as we know, we can see the royal standard behind us right now. The Queen is in, the meetings are happening here. But of course the reason she's staying at Windsor Castle is because Buckingham Palace is open to the tourists at the moment. In the staterooms, there's quite a few Americans and Japanese and British tourists wandering around.
It is, it's a very busy place here, and it's kind of bizarre because of course it's a tourist spectacle, but also these weighty matters of state are happening, and the kind of rather sombre arrival of Theresa May, you know, the end of this torturous premiership really, and then all the expectation that will come of course with Boris Johnson and that moment of kissing of the hands, or the air kiss as it will be. But it also makes you think about those sort of relationships that the Queen has had with those 13 former Prime Ministers. And I think generally it takes a while to warm up between the Queen and her Prime Minister. Of course, she never knows how long she's got them for. Is it going to be a partnership of years, or, as perhaps is the case with Boris Johnson, perhaps it won't last for that long? If we look back in the recent past and we think of, you know, Tony Blair, of course, he brought the Queen to tears, quite literally, when the decommissioning of the Royal Yacht Britannia. But of course, arguably, he was also the man who saved the monarchy in those dark days after Diana's death, where the Queen seemed really out of touch with her people. And by all reports, Gordon Brown, for example, they had quite an initially tetchy relationship, but actually since he left office, she's invited him back and his family to see her. So it's quite odd to predict what kind of relationship she's going to have with Boris, and indeed what kind of relationship she's had with Theresa May.
And as you rightly say, they're private audiences, aren't they? But as the famous sort of Victorian constitutional expert Walter Bagehot said, what is it? The Queen has a right to be consulted, to be informed, and to warn.
She's right to be consulted, to encourage, which is very important, and to warn.
Right.
And the Queen takes her constitutional position very, very seriously. And I think we can assume that in every single audience that she has with her Prime Ministers, she exercises those rights to the full. And I think, you know, more or less consultation perhaps is sought from her. But I've no doubt that she will advise and she will warn. And of course, we've seen recently in sort of speeches she's given, Sandringham, for example, we saw the sort of veiled reference to, you know, the national debate and the need to bring about some kind of harmony in political discourse.
Politicians aren't doing the leading, oh, I'm going to take over and do it myself, yeah.
Quite, and I think that does suggest that, you know, she is going to have some measured words for Boris Johnson, and for all the bluff and bluster that we perhaps associate with him. I mean, these are very weighty moments, and he is a man who has a great love of history. He's written about Churchill, and now to be kind of following in Churchill's footsteps with an audience with the very same Queen, of course. You know, if anything's going to perhaps make him pause and think, then I think this will today.
Anna, for now, thank you very much. We'll be back with you shortly. So the Queen's 14th Prime Minister, it started with Winston Churchill in 1952. It's going on to be a new Prime Minister this afternoon. And perhaps, Nina, it's this afternoon in his audience that the Queen will begin that warning and that encouragement and that consultation with Boris Johnson.
We are awaiting that as we speak. Chris, thank you. And talking of Boris Johnson, let's just bring you some pictures of Admiralty House, which is where he is expected to depart. As we've been saying all afternoon, Bit of a wobbly shot there for you, but I think you get the general idea that the timings are fluid as to how long it takes Theresa May to leave Buckingham Palace. They don't want that awful crossover, Catherine, do they, of one Prime Minister entering and another one leaving. So we have to wait for her to leave before Boris Johnson can begin his journey to the palace.
Exactly. So that's why there's the pause between them. Your question earlier about who's in charge there. I mean, in a cabinet ministers effectively stay in their posts until it's one of these sort of grey areas, but until they're replaced. So during that period, it's not like we don't have any governments at all. But still, it's not the same as it will be in a sort of US presidency where you have that sort of very immediate handover and one continues right up to it. And yeah, it's choreographed. It's choreographed partly by security teams who will have come and taken Boris Johnson in hand to make sure that he's got that security protection going to the palace, the police outriders, all of that. So there's an awful lot of communication going on between Downing Street, the cabinet secretary, and the Prime Minister's private secretary, between the Queen's private secretary and between Boris Johnson's sort of key representative to make sure that it's all targeted. But as David Cameron said when he became Prime Minister in 2010, he had to call up his wife and say, you need to get a frock on because we're off to the palace. It can suddenly happen very quickly when you've got to go and get in the car.
Yeah, absolutely. Catherine, thank you for now. Let's head back to Westminster and join Libby. I think she's got a couple of guests there as we await Boris Johnson departing from Admiralty House. Libby.
Yes, Nina, well, to say things are hotting up here outside the Palace of Westminster would be an understatement. I'm joined now by a man who is currently a Brexit minister, but perhaps more importantly, he knew Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London. In fact, you worked with him on the executive. He does have the reputation as being something of a bumbling fool who's very good at comedy, perhaps not so good at detail. Is that accurate?
Well, that's the impression that his political opponents have projected onto him throughout his political career. And if anything, it's quite useful because it means they don't focus on the real person and they don't actually criticise him effectively. What we saw when we were in City Hall when he was the mayor is 8 years where we got loads of houses built, when violent crime was cut dramatically, major transport infrastructure, and also the really fantastic delivery of the Olympic and Paralympic Games.
But do you think the skills that you saw in action as mayor, do you think those will translate? It's a completely different job being Prime Minister, isn't it, to having to make decisions hour by hour. Is he really up to that?
Well, it's worth remembering that in City Hall in London, you are the ultimate political head of the largest police force in the country, the largest fire brigade in the country, the largest transport system in the country, all of which take major decisions. There is no job quite like being a Prime Minister. Nothing quite prepares you for being a Prime Minister, but it is as good a testing ground as any in British politics for this kind of role.
Hoping to get a job in his cabinet?
Well, everyone in politics is ambitious. What I really want is to see Brexit delivered. I want Boris to be able to deliver on the promises that he has made, which is to get us out by the 31st of October, to make sure that we deliver on that, the other set of promises on housing, on digital infrastructure, transport infrastructure,
what
policing
about bringing
numbers.
in all these people from Vote Leave, Dominic Cummings in particular? How's that going to go down with MPs, do you think?
Well, what we're already seeing is that Boris is building around him a team of people who he knows are effective in delivering. Nobody in politics is universally loved, but what we see...
He was particularly disliked and made his comments very public about what he thought of certain MPs, not least David Davis, who was Brexit secretary.
What we see actually with a number of
Vickers
appointments...
Mints, I think, was the description he used.
A number of appointments that that Boris is making is these are very effective, delivery-focused people, and that gives a clue to the style of government that he is going to bring to number 10. He is all about delivery, and I think that's what people are crying out for. I speak to businesses about Brexit, they want it done. I speak to people about police numbers, they want them up. Housing, they want delivered. So this is really about delivering the promises that he made during the campaign that he's going to bring to number 10.
Do you think he is going to be able to unite the party, though? From what we've heard about the potential top jobs in the cabinet, the candidates he's considering, it does look like he's rewarding Brexiteers. The maths in Parliament means he also has to reach out to Remainers, doesn't he?
Well, one of the things that we saw, one of the first appointments that came into the public domain, was the appointment of a chief whip, Mark Spencer. Very, very well liked, very, very well respected, originally voted for Remain, but is passionate about delivering Brexit. And I think that's again, an indication that Boris will build a team around him from all wings of the party. He got the majority of support amongst MPs during the parliamentary round of voting, and that was in three people still at that point. He got a comprehensive win amongst the members. So he will be a Prime Minister and party leader for the whole party, not just people that voted for Brexit.
James Cleverly, thanks very much, and good luck in your career and prospects.
Thank you.
And now back to you, Nina.
Libby, thank you. Let's take you back to Admiralty House, the other door we're watching this afternoon, and we can also take you through to see Theresa May, the outgoing Prime Minister. She has now left the building, as it were. She has left Buckingham Palace. She is in her non-Prime Ministerial car, making her way through to her constituency in Maidenhead with a mixture, presumably, of regret and some relief after 3 years of trying to get Brexit sorted, trying and failing. It is now somebody else's responsibility to sort that out. Catherine, if I can just mention Admiralty House, do we know why Boris Johnson is there?
No, it's not clear. It looks like he's just heading off shortly. A Prime Minister, I mean, when they come in after a general election, they've come back down to London. They might be in their party headquarters. If they're living in London, they might be in their own home. I think it's just what they did because it's probably most convenient for coordinating it, choreographing it, getting him to the palace quickly. And remember, he's not a minister. He's coming in as a backbench MP, and that is actually quite unusual in terms of takeover of Prime Minister.
Just to let the viewers know, we are, of course, watching Theresa May's car there, and we'll also get back to that shot of... we've seen the police outriders leave Admiralty House. As you say, it's probably imminent that he departs to head to the palace. James Cleverly there, talking about Boris's record in City Hall. As Boris Johnson did lots in the campaign, the month of campaigns at the hustings, the ITV debate, and also the Andrew Neil interviews. One thing he did when he started at City Hall was create his top team. And mistakes were made, and he sorted that out and changed that top team. Surely he can't make that mistake in this job with that top team. Those cabinet appointments are crucial, aren't they, to knowing what sort of Boris Johnson we are likely to get.
Absolutely, and I think it's two sets of appointments that we're looking for. One is much more for sort of the political specialist looking behind the scenes, and that's who he's appointing into number 10. We talked a lot about Dominic Cummings as being this sort of key figure for all of that, and that's really about, how can he be effective behind the scenes. But then there's, the very public, who is his cabinet, what does that tell us about his political position? But remember, with both sets of appointments, the key is people have now quite fixed positions on Brexit, what they want to do.
Catherine, I'm just going to interrupt you there because we are now seeing Boris Johnson making that journey towards Buckingham Palace. As you can see, a line of protesters. There have been protests when these kinds of journeys have been made before, but let's see how the police deal with this one. That is a thin red line of people trying to prevent that moment of Boris Johnson making that first journey towards that job he has long coveted to become the Prime Minister of this country, the 77th Prime Minister, the 14th under the Queen. Of course, we know that Sir Winston Churchill was her first. The Met doing the job there of getting him through. Chris Shipp, he's made it through his first obstacle.
Yeah, there was quite a few whistles of the police, and we were expecting a smooth entry, as you can see, going round the Queen Victoria Monument and into the North Centre Gate of Buckingham Palace right now. That little protest at the end of the Mall there wasn't clearly expected. From what I can see here, I mean, there's quite a few members of the public watching. There's the odd jeer from the sound of it as well from the crowd. There's not a huge amount of cheering, put it that way. And I think that that particular protest, as you rightly say, Nina, perhaps one of the first obstacles that Boris Johnson might come to expect as Prime Minister.
that car
He's
about
round
to
into the
park.
quadrangle.
I wonder, Chris, what will be going through his head right now. This is the moment. He's campaigned for a month, but as most people know, the campaign for Boris Johnson has been going on for years, potentially decades longer than that.
Well, I think at the moment he'll be sorely focused on the audience he's about to have. He's met at the King's Door, it's known as, in the quadrangle there, by the Queen's equerry waiting, a Ghanaian soldier serving with the household cavalry called Nana Chumsi Ankara, and also the Queen's private secretary. That's the most senior officer, if you like. Let me bring Anna Whitelock back in, who's still with me here. I mean, clearly unexpected little protest. It held him up by a matter of seconds, but not something the police were expecting from the seams of it.
Yeah, and you know what? There really was quite literally a change of pace, it felt, from one administration to the other. You really felt as the cars came along here, they really did speed up, and it just sensed the changing of gear from the May years to the Boris years, that everything's slightly more energised, slightly more panic, slightly more controversial, and there really was a kind of whoosh passed into the palace. And as you say, I think it might be the first of many kind of controversial noises perhaps that Boris is going to get used to when he makes these kind of public appearances.
And his audience he's having with the Queen, he'll go in through the King's Door, he'll turn right and go up to the private apartments of Buckingham Palace. So there's not much chance of bumping into any tourists in there. But the audience, as we were saying earlier, this is the exact moment that he'll do this kissing of hands, and the Queen will invite him to be her next Prime Minister and, crucially, ask him if he has the confidence of the House of Commons.
Yes, of course, we've heard a lot about confidence in the Commons, and in a way it's quite a pointed phrase, but it is the phrase that she will ask. Do you have the confidence of the House of Commons to form a government? And he will say yes. And at that point, that kissing of the hands will happen. But these are, as you say, weighty moments, and they're also quite lonely moments for Boris Johnson. You know, there's not a crowd to play to. It's the Queen, who, of course, has been there many times before. And, of course, this is the first time for many years since Edward Heath that we have a Prime Minister without a spouse by his side. He's there on his own, and he's going to, of course, be walking through Downing Street alone, without the kind of family around him that we've got used to in recent years. So, you know, lonely moments in a sense for Boris Johnson. And if he was, you know, needed to be brought down to earth and quite what responsibility now awaits him, I think this is the moment where that sort of realisation is going to dawn.
Interesting times. Anna, thank you very much indeed. The police motorcycles have just gone past behind us here, resetting presumably for the journey back. We wonder whether that will be as smooth or slightly bumpy as the journey here turned out to be.
Not long to wait now, Chris Ship. Thank you. Just some detail for you. Apparently, the protesters you saw there in those red T-shirts were climate change protesters, not anti-Brexit protesters or campaigners who are anti-Boris Johnson either. We'll have more for you on this special programme on the new Prime Minister in just a few minutes' time. Welcome back to you. If you've just joined us, Boris Johnson has made it into Buckingham Palace. A few tricky moments on his way as he travelled in his car with that police escort. Stopped there briefly by protesters, I believe, climate change protesters, not what the Met will have wanted in terms of their role in the smooth transition, the handover of power from one Prime Minister to the next. It's a really sunny July afternoon out there, and those protesters, which we believe are from Greenpeace, are not the only ones out and about. Lots of different pockets of protests throughout central London this afternoon. Juliet Bremner can join me now from Westminster with somebody else who has taken to the streets today. Juliet.
Yes, that's right. I've been at Westminster all morning and we've seen all kinds of protesters here, not just the pro-Remain and the pro-Leave people, but also the taxi drivers in the distance behind me have brought Westminster Square to a standstill. But I am with two younger activists who this morning unfurled their banners on Parliament Square. I'm joined by Laron Velleman and Rosie McKenna. They're both from the People's Vote Youth Movement, excuse me. Can you tell me, why are you not welcoming a change at Downing Street? Why do you not want to see a new Prime Minister full of hope and enthusiasm?
Because I'm not sure that's what we're seeing today. We're seeing a new Prime Minister who has made it clear that he wants to impose either a no deal or an incredibly hard Brexit deal on our country, which is a democratic outrage, as only 160,000 people even had the opportunity to vote for our new Prime Minister. And for us, it's clear, the promises that were made in 2016 about Brexit haven't been delivered and will never be delivered under Boris Johnson. And therefore, we demand a people's vote on that Brexit deal.
And what about you, Rosie? Are you not prepared to give him a chance to try and change things to get some kind of deal through Brussels so we can escape this whole Brexit business?
Well, Boris Johnson has obviously been a cabinet minister and has been very prominent in the media. I think he's had his chance to make his case, and he's been very clear that he is more than willing to take us out on a hard Brexit deal. He's been very clear that he believes that we're better off outside of the EU, and we're not entirely sure that's the case. 0.25% of the electorate had the chance to vote for this Prime Minister, had the chance to say they agree with that. However, that is not necessarily representative of the entirety of the United Kingdom, and we don't believe there's a mandate for this.
Right, you are asking for another vote, but he said he's not interested in that. How are you really going to bring it about? You had a large poster today, but that's not going to do it, is it?
Well, I think yes, we have a new Prime Minister today, but the parliamentary arithmetic hasn't changed. We're still in the situation where Parliament is deadlocked. There is no majority for any form of Brexit, and the only way out of that is at some point to take it back to the people to look at it again, because there's no other way forward through parliamentary means. So far, your protests have been very peaceful. Are they going to stay that way? Yes, we are strong in our opinions. We want to put them forward forcefully, but we believe in remaining within the law and making sure we make our case in a peaceful way. Do you think, Rosie, that this is going to be a more divisive time? Are we going to see more protesters out to oppose what is a Marmite Prime Minister, if you like? Some love him, some loathe him.
I do think that since the People's Vote campaign started in March, around that time last year, we have seen more and more people get involved with the campaign, more and more people changing their minds and realising that actually this isn't what was promised in 2016, and there is another option. So I think that, yes, we will see a growing movement for this.
Both, thanks very much indeed, and now back to you.
Juliet, thank you. Let's stay on this theme of protest now and rejoin Robert in Downing Street. In all your years of covering politics, have you ever seen such a moment like that? Boris Johnson making his way to the palace for his first audience with the Queen to become the Prime Minister of the country, and getting stopped there, albeit briefly, by protesters.
Quite extraordinary. Literally nothing, I think, like it in modern times. Boris Johnson off to be made Prime Minister, have power at last conferred on him. It's something he's actually wanted, as we understand it, since he was a schoolboy. And then to see those red-shirted protesters blocking the Mall, climate change protesters, genuinely an image that speaks to how divided the country Boris Johnson is inheriting is over climate change, also very much over Brexit. Now, I think we're getting quite close to the moment where Boris Johnson is going to sweep into Downing Street, because just arriving are a whole bunch of his supporters, and they're standing outside number 11 Downing Street already. So we're very much approaching the moment when Boris Johnson will be returning from the palace and entering 10 Downing Street, not as a guest of another Prime Minister, but as the United Kingdom's new Prime Minister. And as I just mentioned, in some ways this is an extraordinary personal moment, because he is famously one of the most ambitious people this country has produced for generations, having, you know, he sort of set his sights on Downing Street donkey's years ago.
Robert Paston, thank you. Well, let's take you back to the palace now, because we're just bringing you pictures of the car there, the prime ministerial car that will take Boris Johnson on his first journey as Prime Minister back to Downing Street, where Robert is waiting for that arrival in the quadrangle of the palace while we await him departing the palace. And from that conversation, that meeting, the kissing of the hands tradition with the Queen, I'm joined now by the Brexit Minister, Kwasi Kwarteng. Thank you very much for joining me. Look, to many people, Boris Johnson is seen as the most divisive Prime Minister since potentially Margaret Thatcher. But this is somebody who he hasn't even taken one step in Downing Street, and he's being judged right now on his personality and his past performance rather than his policies. We haven't seen those yet. We know what he wants with Brexit, but not much detail beyond that. Can he win his doubters around? Because he won over the Tory membership and the MPs. But what about everybody watching now who has doubts about him, who needs to vote for him if he wants to do what he says he's going to do and beat Jeremy Corbyn?
Look, I think Boris is a very strong performer. He's a very strong executive. He's been Mayor of London. He was Mayor of London for 8 years. He got re-elected. And at the time he got re-elected, the Tory party, the Conservatives, were 17 points behind Labour, and he managed to overcome that. So he's got a job to do. No one's saying it's going to be easy, but I think he's got the character and the force of personality and the intellect really to deliver Brexit and to unite the country so that we can win an election.
He's a winner for the Tory party.
Absolutely.
Lots of other people would say he is a racist, he is a liar, he has made homophobic comments. He has, in the campaign period, he has apologised for the offence caused. But once you have been called and accused of those things, you can't take back those comments.
Look, people have been saying all sorts of things about Boris for 25 years. Some of the remarks that people point to were written 18, 19 years ago. It's extraordinary that people are going back that far. And I remember, as a candidate...
Is that an excuse for
no, I'm not saying it's an excuse, but I'm saying that
somebody in a way that they wouldn't want to be described?
But forgive me, I mean, we've rehearsed these arguments endlessly. I remember in 2008, that was 11 years ago, people said exactly the same things. And they said, how can you have this man be Mayor of London? And you know what? He was elected mayor, he did well, and he was re-elected. And so nobody expected that.
Criticisms go away and we all have to forget the things that he's been criticised for?
All I'm saying is that these criticisms have been made ad nauseam, have been made repeatedly over 20 years. And what we've got to do is come together and move forward. Big personalities, big politicians have always had people for them and against them. He's a big personality, he's a big politician.
OK,
and that's exactly why I think he will be able to deliver Brexit and unite the country.
You've been in the role for just over 6 months. What is he going to say? What is he going to do when he first goes to the EU and says, this is what we're going to do? We're not going to do what you're saying we're going to do. We're not going to just ratify Theresa May's withdrawal agreement. We're going to do something different. What's he going to say that's going to convince everybody who is in charge of the EU, both now and in the next few months, that what he's doing is enough to change their minds? The EU says it's not for turning.
So, as you say, I've been in the department 8 months. I voted for the deal, Theresa May's deal, 3 times. And that didn't get through. So something has to shift. Now, Boris has been very clear that no deal must be on the table. What happened in March this year was that the Prime Minister, having said that we would leave on the 29th of March, I think 100 times, then wrote a letter to the EU asking for an extension. Boris has been very clear that he won't do that. Now, I'm told that the EU won't change, they won't move. I don't think that's quite true. On alternative arrangements, for example, last year, they said there was no possibility that we would have or we could have alternative arrangements. This year, they've said they're quite willing to look at alternative arrangements again. So that they're not the monolithic, implacable group of people that they're often portrayed as in the media. I think they are flexible. I think if you look at the noises from Macron and others, they want Brexit to be sorted out. as does Boris, and I think we can actually come to an agreement.
And if they're not, we can discuss what happens next in the next 99 days as the afternoon goes on. Kwasi, I know you're going to stay with me, so thank you for that. Let's head back to the pictures of Buckingham Palace and just take a closer look at the car now. This big moment for UK politics as we await Prime Minister Johnson departing the palace after speaking to the Queen there. His team are awaiting his arrival as well. There they are outside Downing Street, while all the focus today, quite rightly so, is on London and what's happening in Westminster and at Downing Street. Of course, what matters is what matters next for the whole of the United Kingdom, both within their relationship with the EU, but also the United Kingdom in general. So with that in mind, let's go to the handover of power and the consequences much further afield. In a moment, we'll be speaking to both our correspondents, John Ray, who's at Stormont, and Emily Morgan in Edinburgh. What happens in the next 99 days in the EU, as I've been saying, is crucial to Northern Ireland's future and the United Kingdom itself, John.
That's right, and I think it's only fair to say that Boris Johnson begins his new job with a huge deficit of trust in this part of the world, though I dare say he's not the first British Prime Minister to start with that particular handicap. But, you know, critics and some of his supporters have pointed out to me, look, here is a man who, on the one hand, vociferously rules out any idea of the Irish backstop, but in fact voted for it, albeit at the third time of asking in Parliament with the withdrawal agreement. People say here that the politics of this country is so complex that they wonder whether Boris Johnson is a man with the character, with the concentration powers to really grasp that. Or somebody said to me, look, what you need in Northern Ireland is somebody as sure-footed as a mountain goat, and what we fear we're getting is a bull in a china shop. I think that probably rather underestimates Boris Johnson. He spent a lot of time here recently. He was here for the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party conference. He schmoozed Arlene Foster, the DUP leader, here at Stormont, which should be the headquarters of the Northern Ireland government. Why is he doing that? Well, because he knows that he relies for now, until the next general election, on the votes of those 10 DUP MPs to make him Prime Minister. Without them, he just doesn't have that majority in Parliament.
John Ray, thank you very much. Let's head up to Edinburgh and join Emily Morgan. The SNP's Ian Blackford last night saying Boris Johnson could be the UK's final Prime Minister. From their point of view, their focus is trying to get a second referendum on independence for Scotland.
Yes, absolutely, and I think that is the big question for Scotland. As Scots woke up this morning having digested the news that their new Prime Minister would be Boris Johnson, the big question is, would he turbocharge support for an independent Scotland? And if a new poll, a Snap YouGov poll that's out today is anything to go by, then I think he might well do that. 60% of Scots asked say they are dismayed and disappointed at him becoming their new Prime Minister. And one of the reasons for that is because Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in Europe. And Boris Johnson, of course, is the man who campaigned to take the UK out of Europe. He won, so he's a very divisive character here. And they think that he is going to impose something upon them that they didn't vote for. He has also said that he would accept a no-deal Brexit if he can't get a deal. And for Scots, that is the worst of all worlds, out of Europe with a no-deal. Many predict that a no-deal Brexit could be very harsh on Scotland, could be bad for the economy, and could reduce GDP by 8%. And Nicola Sturgeon is taking this as an opportunity. She says she would like to accelerate her timetable for a second independence referendum. So we'll have to see in the next few months whether that comes to fruition.
Emily Morgan in Edinburgh, thank you. Let's head back to Downing Street now, where Boris Johnson's team, the new team for the new Prime Minister, are waiting his arrival. We're also watching his car, the Prime Minister's car at Buckingham Palace. He hasn't yet emerged from the palace. Talking there about what his appointment means for the SNP. Let's cross to Libby, who can take us through what it means for Labour. She's joined by Sir Keir Starmer. And while that interview is taking place, I will keep an eye on those those pictures, those two locations, for when Boris Johnson does emerge from the palace. For now, though, Libby.
Yes, Nina, well, I'm joined, as you say, by Keir Starmer. You'll have a new government to work with, but for all intents and purposes today, you're more observers than participants, except for one thing. At Prime Minister's questions, Theresa May's parting shot was suggesting that Jeremy Corbyn stand aside. Do you agree with her?
Well, no, of course I don't, and that's the sort of thing that Prime Ministers say when they are leaving. But there is a changing of the guard today, and in will come Boris Johnson. Strangely, we'll then go into recess, because obviously what we want to do is to hold him to account, because this is a man who's made many promises over the last 3 years. He made many promises in the referendum campaign, and he's never had to be held to account for them. He's never really taken responsibility for them. I think he's going to see pretty quickly there's a massive difference between throwaway lines at a hustings, things said at a referendum, and actually standing up and negotiating and delivering. And I think that's going to be the critical bit.
But a big problem for you is not so much that Parliament's going into recess, it's that people still don't know where you stand on Brexit.
Well, I think it's clear enough that any deal now, any outcome, whether Boris Johnson's able to get a deal or not, we'll have to see. I was in Brussels yesterday, and he's obviously going to struggle, it seems to me. But whether he gets a deal or no deal, we've said this has got to go back now to the public to make sure they're comfortable with this. There's got to be a referendum, and we'll campaign for Remain. So
definitely Remain. Not everyone in the top brass in the Labour Party seems to be singing from that hymn.
No, that's not right. We set out a policy position 2 weeks ago now, and that was a policy position that Shadow Cabinet signed off. Jeremy Corbyn made a statement about it. That's the policy position. Campaign for Remain in a referendum. This must go back for consent, because we're in a place now that nobody expected us to be 3 years ago. This doesn't accord with what Boris Johnson was saying in the referendum. This is what he promised. And therefore, we need to know from the public, is this actually the way in which you want to leave the EU? And if it's not, wouldn't you rather remain? It's actually about permission, if you like, to leave on these terms, or to remain if you don't want to leave.
How concerned are you that we are heading for no deal?
Well, I am concerned because although Theresa May said it's my deal or no deal, I always thought deep down that her sort of sense of public duty and her recognition of just how damaging that would mean she'd never actually do it. Now we have someone who has made lots of reckless promises and proposals, this I do or die. Well, if we get to the 31st of October without a deal and leave without a deal, that does put not just trade into a very difficult position, it'll be a rupture, but security and counter-terrorism. And you can't be reckless about it. These are not slogans, these are not throwaway things.
Thank you very much indeed. Now back to you, Nina, in the studio.
Libby, thank you very much. Life comes at you fast when you are the new Prime Minister. Here is the first photograph of Prime Minister Johnson in power, shaking the hand of the Queen there. We weren't perhaps expecting that photograph quite so quickly. Robert Peston at Downing Street, we've got the first image of what a Prime Minister Johnson might look like, what his premiership might look like. There we go.
Yes, there we are, the moment he's been waiting for, meeting the Queen, the touching of hands, transfer of power from Theresa May to Boris Johnson. Lots of excitement here in Downing Street because we've just seen Larry the cat, who is the big celebrity who lives in these parts. Won't be long now till Boris Johnson turns up. Far be it from me to be cynical and say there's a bit of stage management of his image going on. You saw those shots of supporters and people working for him standing outside number 11. Very interesting, they removed some of the older members, some of the more obviously white British members, so that the face that Boris Johnson wants to present to the UK of his administration, lots of women, lots of young people, lots of sort of people from diverse backgrounds, ethnic minorities. He does not want to be typecast as a white middle-class, middle-aged, public school Prime Minister leading a government in his image. As I said earlier, he's desperate to be shown to be representing modern Britain. Brexit, the great priority. You were talking earlier about his important non-ministerial appointments. One of the most important is of a bloke called David Frost, who used to work with him at the Foreign Office, who is going to replace somebody who became really quite famous in Britain, a chap called Ollie Robbins, as our main negotiator with the EU. Now, the big difference between Ollie Robbins and David Frost is that David Frost is a true believer in Brexit and shares Boris Johnson's view that if we can't get a deal, a no-deal Brexit is acceptable. So another one of those absolutely crucial appointments already made. But of course, the ones that most of the nation are waiting for are the big cabinet jobs like Chancellor, Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary, all of which I expect will get confirmed tonight.
Robert Peston, thank you. Some fascinating detail there about the detail of exactly who greets him when Prime Minister Johnson arrives at Downing Street and how that has been manoeuvred and manipulated, perhaps. Let's take you back to Downing Street, to Buckingham Palace, and we are awaiting him leaving the palace. Chris Shipp, we've seen that first photo. I'm frantically scouring it for any clues, any detail of what their future relationship may be. Of course, they have history. They were involved in the Olympics of London 2012 together. He is a very well-known politician. He will be very well-known indeed to the Queen. Any clues that you're picking up from that photograph?
Well, what can you tell from a photograph, a very first photograph in the audience room of the Queen's private apartments there in Buckingham Palace? Look, the Queen reads her papers assiduously. She does it every single day, no matter where she is in the country. And she may have had to delay her plans to go on holiday to Balmoral in order to do this very thing this afternoon, but that is her duty as head of state. She's back in Buckingham Palace just temporarily. She'll go back to Windsor Castle shortly, but tomorrow she will not only meet Boris Johnson for a second time as Prime Minister, she'll also meet a number of his new cabinet, because anyone who has got a new cabinet position will have to attend tomorrow's Privy Council meeting, which has been confirmed is happening. It's happening at Buckingham Palace, so the Queen will get to see Boris Johnson for a second time. So she hasn't entirely made up her mind, Nina, about what she makes of him this afternoon. She'll have another opportunity to do so tomorrow. But now that's happened, that picture you can see on the screen there, he'll be into the car, which is waiting for him in the quadrangle of Buckingham Palace, and then back up the Mall. Quite whether he'll have a smooth ride back up the Mall or not, we don't know. I think the police were rather taken by surprise by that protest on Boris Johnson's way into Buckingham Palace. I can see quite a few more police vehicles around. One suspects they'll be looking out for it now and won't want any hint of disruption on the way back. There's a couple of ways he could go back. He doesn't just have to go up the Mall. He could go on another road on the other side of St James's Park called Birdcage Walk. But either way, it made for an interesting start to his premiership.
Thank you. Let me talk once again to Kwasi Kwarteng. Thank you very much for joining us. Look, as we focus on the pictures and we await that moment where he leaves Buckingham Palace, I just want to ask you, when Labour left power and handed over to the coalition, there was that famous note left, I'm afraid there's no money left. There's no money.
That's right.
What should May's note say to Boris Johnson, had she written one? I'm
not sure
she
whether
hasn't.
she would have done. I think she would wish him all the best. I think she had a drinks party for colleagues in the Parliamentary Party, Conservatives and DUP, and she spoke very warmly of the next Conservative government. So I think she'll be wishing him the best and hoping that he can actually deliver Brexit, which has sadly eluded us.
What do you make of this still, that first image of Prime Minister Johnson, the man who's wanted this power? He's got it now.
I think Boris is incredibly mindful of his responsibility. As someone said earlier, he's written about Winston Churchill. He's a prolific writer. He loves British history. And he will be very conscious of how serious and momentous a day it is. Not just for him. It's not about him. It's really about our country and how we can deliver Brexit and move forward, move on and unite the country.
Will we see a Churchillian type speech later. We saw the Boris Johnson we know yesterday making that speech at the point that he had won the Tory leadership. What will we see later?
I think he will try and convey a degree of seriousness. I think he'll reinforce his vision in terms of trying to deliver Brexit and unite the country. And I think he does have a very positive message. He's a naturally an ebullient and optimistic person. I thought a telling moment in the hustings was when Jeremy Hunt accused him of peddling optimism. That's exactly what the country needs right now. We need an optimistic, energetic leader, and I think Boris is that person.
He's a divisive figure. Any surprise on the appointment of another divisive figure, Dominic Cummings, into one of these key roles, not of course in the cabinet, but key roles in modern day politics, behind the scenes?
Dominic is a very highly intelligent, highly professional political mind, and I think any government that has his services will be stronger for it. I think he's a really good operator, he's a really good thinker, he's got very clear way of thinking, a way of strategizing.
That's one opinion. A lot of people have very different opinions of him. Was it the right thing at the right time when he's trying to unite the Tory party and, crucially, unite the country to bring in a figure who critics would have such an easy hit at?
So Boris wants to get the best possible team, and Dominic Cummings, no one would say, even his critics, would say that Dominic is a highly effective performer, he's a highly effective operator in political circles. He's someone who can get the job done. Even his critics acknowledge his quality. And I think it's excellent that Boris is bringing talented people into the machine at number 10.
Kwasi, for now, thank you. Catherine, we've got, of course, no access to that private meeting with the Queen. We've seen the photograph now. So, from your experience, what would be happening right now inside the palace?
Well, it depends whether he's come out or not from that conversation. I mean, obviously, you know, this is the Queen's moment as well as the new Prime Minister's. So perhaps they wanted to have a longer chat. Who knows? She's famously, you know, very good for the conversational period, but also, you know, really knows her stuff. So she might have wanted to get into some detail. But he also, once he's come out of that meeting, there's a good chance that he's meeting with his principal private secretary, the key official that will work with him in number 10, alongside all of his political appointments, and perhaps then talking to his team on the phone and talking about the next stage of choreography, because we saw those people outside number 10, they could be civil servants. His team will want to make sure that the next bit is choreographed well.
Catherine, I'm just going to pause with you there because we are seeing there, this is Carrie Symonds, this is Boris Johnson's girlfriend, of course, in the red and white dress there. This is a big moment because there was great speculation whether she would be by his side for this moment in history, this moment where he gets the keys to the door of number 10 Downing Street. We, of course, saw Philip May depart Downing Street with Theresa May, but great speculation of the message it may or may not send out to the country that he is there with his girlfriend. And we will see later on this afternoon whether she will be by his side, whether she will make that small journey from the lectern to the door of number 10 and take part in the clapping in ceremony, and whether that is the case, we'll have to wait a few minutes. Kwasi, do you think she will? It will be a symbolic moment if a big smile on your face.
I really don't know what role Carrie will play officially in the proceedings. I can't tell you.
What does it tell us about Prime Minister Johnson, though, that they've obviously, look, Team Boris, the people behind Boris Johnson will be calculating every move from this point onwards, and they have made this decision. Somebody in his team, in Boris Johnson's team, has made this decision. She is to be part of the narrative from day one.
I don't think it's that big a deal. It's no secret that he's in a relationship with Carrie. It's no secret also that Carrie is herself someone who has experience of politics. She worked in Conservative headquarters. She's someone who is a highly professional person. I think she's a good addition to the team.
But we haven't seen her in the month-long campaign, have we? And that period where neighbours of theirs reported them to the police because of a row that they accused the couple of having. It threatened, albeit briefly, to derail his campaign, to derail this moment where he got the job that he's long coveted. So this is still a big moment that she is here.
So you referred to the incident earlier in the campaign. It didn't derail the campaign. It was seen as quite a trivial incident, and it didn't detract from his issues. I mean, he fought a good campaign. As I think James cleverly pointed out earlier, he got 50% more than 50% of the MPs, and also got a decisive and comprehensive mandate with the members. So he's in a very strong position, and I look forward to his premiership.
Catherine, how important are first impressions? Because many people were taken aback by Theresa May's speech when she first entered Downing Street. And then the Theresa May we saw then, we didn't really see again. So how key is this speech in modern day politics, where they can present as one person and then a few months down the line, priorities change in the context of Brexit?
I mean, all the stuff we're talking about at the moment, the crowds, you know, even possibly the protests, and certainly Carrie's presence, which she may have decided herself to be there, not his team. That's not as important as the speech, because the speech is the thing. We're looking back at Theresa May's speech now and saying, did she do this? Did she do this? Did she do this? That's the thing where he basically sets out his own manifesto, because he hasn't come into government with a general election manifesto. He's still got the 2017 one, but how much of that he'll carry on, we don't know.
Here he goes. Boris Johnson has left the palace. Prime Minister Johnson, Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson, emerging from Buckingham Palace as Prime Minister Johnson. Chris Shipp, he has left the building.
So the Queen has done her duty. The hands have been kissed on appointment, and there, leaving the quadrangle of Buckingham Palace, is Prime Minister Boris Johnson. What, little over an hour after the outgoing Prime Minister Theresa May went in there, and we just had a statement from Buckingham Palace as he leaves. It says the Queen received an audience, the Right Honourable Boris Johnson MP, this afternoon, and requested him to form a new administration. The statement goes on, Mr Johnson accepted Her Majesty's offer and kissed hands upon his appointment as Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury. And that ends the statement that's just been released by Buckingham Palace as Boris Johnson drives behind us and back up the Mall. No protest this time. That's about the spot where he was temporarily delayed on his way in, and he's now on his way from this palace to somewhere close to the Palace of Westminster, just around the corner from there, of course, 10 Downing Street, now as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Let's cross to Downing Street, where that car is now heading, and join Robert, driving down Whitehall, one turn right into Downing Street, Robert, and his journey is nearly complete. His journey that has been a long time coming. Some would say it's been Boris Johnson's destiny to be Prime Minister. The Tory party has certainly decided it is worth trying him out now at this crucial of times as we try to exit the EU in 99 days' time on October the 31st. He is making his way to you as we speak, Robert.
Yeah, I mean, an extraordinary story, really. As young political, ambitious political young men, David Cameron and Boris Johnson vied with each other to climb the greasy pole. David Cameron became Prime Minister first. You remember they were at school together, both at Eton, both at Oxford. But Boris Johnson has now got there and, you know, is about to start what he would think of as the great adventure, but he takes over at a time of huge challenge for this country. We've missed our Brexit deadline twice. There's another one looming on the 31st of October. His central pledge in his leadership campaign is that he would take the UK out on the 31st of October, but formidable obstacles in the way. Now, as you just mentioned, in that sort of human side of the story, we were all very struck that Carrie Symonds, his girlfriend, has actually emerged to be one of the many people working for him, standing in the background outside number 11 to give him a big cheer when he arrived. She's standing next to one of his senior advisors, a man called Eddie Lister, who worked for him when he was Mayor of London. And I think the deliberate symbolism of her being with the team is to show that she will be at the heart of the operation, as obviously as well as being his girlfriend and providing the support that any girlfriend would give. Because, of course, she was, as you will remember, Director of Communications of the Conservative Party, a Tory from the top of her hair to the tips of her toes, and she would always take the view that she's got important things to say of a political nature. So I think we are now about to get Boris Johnson arrive in Downing Street in the official prime ministerial car. The lectern is all set up. I'm assuming that he will get straight out of the car and address the nation for the very first time as Prime Minister. I'm expecting him to lay out his priorities as Prime Minister. We've talked incessantly about that challenge to get the UK out of the EU, but he will also be focusing on domestic priorities, more money for the health service as rapidly as possible, more money for schools, more money for roads and railways. And he's also obsessed with broadband, getting broadband fibre into every home. So here he comes now. He's leaving his car, striding up to the lectern. Oh, yep, we're getting the round of applause. And any second now, he's going to speak.
Good afternoon. I have just been to see Her Majesty the Queen, who has invited me to form a government, and I have accepted. I pay tribute to the fortitude and patience of my predecessor and her deep sense of public service. But in spite of all her efforts, it has become clear that there are pessimists at home and abroad who think, after 3 years of indecision, that this country has become a prisoner to the old arguments of 2016. And in this home of democracy, we are incapable of honouring a democratic mandate. And so I am standing before you today to tell you, the British people, that those critics are wrong. The doubters, the doomsters, the gloomsters, they are going to get it wrong again. The people who bet against Britain are going to lose their shirts because we're going to restore trust in our democracy. And we're going to fulfill the repeated promises of Parliament to the people and come out of the EU on October the 31st, no ifs or buts. And we will do a new deal, a better deal, that will maximise the opportunities of Brexit while allowing us to develop a new and exciting partnership with the rest of Europe, based on free trade and mutual support. I have every confidence that in 99 days' time we will have cracked it. But you know what? We aren't going to wait 99 days, because the British people have had enough of waiting. The time has come to act, to take decisions, to give strong leadership and to change this country for the better. And though the Queen has just honoured me with this extraordinary office of state, my job is to serve you, the people. Because if there is one point we politicians need to remember, it is that the people are our bosses. My job is to make your streets safer. And we're going to go in with another 20,000 police on the streets, and we start recruiting forthwith. My job is to make sure you don't have to wait 3 weeks to see your GP. And we start work this week with 20 new hospital upgrades and ensuring that the money for the NHS really does get to the front line. My job is to protect you or your parents or grandparents from the fear of having to sell your home to pay for the costs of care. And so I am announcing now on the steps of Downing Street that we will fix the crisis in social care once and for all, with a clear plan we have prepared to give every older person the dignity and security they deserve. My job is to make sure your kids get a superb education wherever they are in the country, and that's why we have already announced that we're going to level up per pupil funding in primary and secondary schools. And that is the work that begins immediately behind that black door. And though I am today building a great team of men and women, I will take personal responsibility for the change I want to see. Never mind the backstop, the buck stops here. And I will tell you something else about my job. It is to be Prime Minister of the whole United Kingdom. And that means uniting our country, answering at last the plea of the forgotten people and the left-behind towns by physically and literally renewing the ties that bind us together, so that with safer streets and better education and fantastic new road and rail infrastructure and full fibre broadband, we level up across Britain with higher wages, a higher living wage, higher productivity. We close the opportunity gap, giving millions of young people the chance to own their own homes and giving business the confidence to invest across the UK. Because it is time we unleashed the productive power, not just of London and the South East, but of every corner of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. The awesome foursome that are incarnated in that red, white and blue flag, who together are so much more than the sum of their parts, and whose brand and political personality is admired and even loved around the world for our inventiveness, for our humour, for our universities, our scientists, our armed forces, our diplomacy, for the equalities on which we insist, whether race or gender or LGBT or the right of every girl in the world to 12 years of quality education, for the values we stand for around the world. Everyone knows the values that flag represents. It stands for freedom and free speech and habeas corpus and the rule of law, and above all it stands for democracy. And that is why we will come out of the EU on October the 31st, because in the end, Brexit was a fundamental decision by the British people, that they wanted their laws made by people that they can elect and they can remove from office. And we must now respect that decision and create a new partnership with our European friends, as warm, as close and as affectionate as possible. And the first step is to repeat unequivocally our guarantee to the 3.2 million EU nationals now living and working among us. And I say directly to you, thank you. Thank you for your contribution to our society. Thank you for your patience. And I can assure you that under this government, you will have the absolute certainty of the right to live and remain. And I say next to our friends in Ireland and in Brussels and around the EU, I am convinced we can do a deal without checks at the Irish border, because we refuse under any circumstances to have such checks, and yet without that anti-democratic backstop. And it is of course vital at the same time that we prepare for the remote possibility that Brussels refuses any further to negotiate. And we are forced to come out with no deal, not because we want that outcome, of course not, but because it is only common sense to prepare. And let me stress that there is a vital sense in which those preparations cannot be wasted, and that is because under any circumstances we will need to get ready at some point in the near future to come out of the EU customs union and out of regulatory control, fully determined at last to take advantage of Brexit, because that is the course on which this country is now set. With high hearts and growing confidence, we will now accelerate the work of getting ready, and the ports will be ready, and the banks will be ready, and the factories will be ready, and business will be ready, and the hospitals will be ready, and our amazing food and farming sector will be ready and waiting to continue selling ever more, not just here but around the world. And don't forget that in the event of a no-deal outcome, we will have that extra lubrication of the £39 billion. And whatever deal we do, we will prepare this autumn for an economic package to boost British business and to lengthen this country's lead as the #1 destination in this continent for overseas investment. And to all those who continue to prophesy disaster, I say yes, there will be difficulties, though I believe that with energy and application they will be far less serious than some have claimed. But if there is one thing that has really sapped the confidence of business over the last 3 years, it is not the decisions we have taken, it is our refusal to take decisions. And to those who say we cannot be ready, I say, do not underestimate this country. Do not underestimate our powers of organisation and our determination, because we know the enormous strengths of this economy in life sciences, in tech, in academia, in music, the arts, culture, financial services. It is here in Britain that we are using gene therapy for the first time to treat the most common form of blindness. Here in Britain that we are leading the world in battery technology that will help cut CO2 and tackle climate change and produce green jobs for the next generation. And as we prepare for a post-Brexit future, it is time we look not at the risks, but at the opportunities that are upon us. So let us begin work now to create free ports that will drive growth and thousands of high-skilled jobs in left-behind areas. Let's start now to liberate the UK's extraordinary bioscience sector from anti-genetic modification rules. And let's develop the blight-resistant crops that will feed the world. Let's get going now on our own position, navigation, and timing satellite and Earth observation systems. UK assets orbiting in space with all the long-term strategic and commercial benefits for this country. Let's change the tax rules to provide extra incentives to invest in capital and research. And let's promote the welfare of animals that has always been so close to the hearts of the British people. And yes, let's start now on those free trade deals, because it is free trade that has done more than anything else to lift billions out of poverty. All this and more we can do now and only now, at this extraordinary moment in our history. And after 3 years of unfounded self-doubt, it is time to change the record, to recover our natural and historic role as an enterprising, outward-looking and truly global Britain, generous in temper and engaged with the world. No one in the last few centuries has succeeded in betting against the pluck and nerve and ambition of this country. They will not succeed today. We, in this government, will work flat out to give this country the leadership it deserves. And that work begins now. Thank you very much.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson entering number 10 alone there. An energised Boris Johnson, sticking with the narrative of energising the country. Big promises on Brexit, no ifs, no buts, out by Halloween, and a promise to fix the crisis in social care. Both really matter to people, both incredibly difficult problems, dilemmas to sort. Robert, no real surprises in that speech. What did you make of it?
So very upbeat. It's what Tory MPs wanted to hear. Tory members elected him largely, some would say, for a couple of reasons. One is because, you know, he led the Brexit campaign, he really believes in Brexit, and most Tory members want the UK to get out of the EU. But secondly, because he's the great optimist, he's the great campaigner in elections who tends to win, and they want a winner. And what you saw, or heard and saw just now, was a man who has enormous self-belief. It actually felt to me like the beginning, and dare I say it, of an election campaign. He was staking out what he promises to deliver, not only leaving the EU, no ifs, no buts, he said, on the 31st of October, but more money for schools, as I said earlier, more money for hospitals, road, rail, the police. He's a pledge to sort out the crisis in care for older people, what's known as social care. Sounded to me like an election manifesto. He also wanted to persuade the British people that even if there is a no-deal Brexit, that will not be curtains for this country. He said anybody who bets against the pluck and nerve of this country tends to lose. But we also, again, just now had a very clear manifestation of how divided the country is, because outside the gates of Downing Street, lots of boos, lots of jeers, lots of people who don't like a no-deal Brexit, who oppose this government for a variety of reasons. We should not forget that for all his popularity within the Tory party, Boris Johnson nationally is a divisive figure.
Robert, he seemed to be stressing the immediacy of his in-tray. We're heading for recess. The focus very much on this 99 days to October the 31st, that deadline. What do you think we can expect in those first crucial months?
Look, he's going to be working day and night, no chance of a holiday, despite the fact that this is a man who historically has rather liked his holidays. I mean, strikingly, this chap, Dominic Cummings, who's taking over to effectively run the campaign to take us out, or run the process of trying to get us out of the EU, has actually cancelled an operation that he was supposed to be having today in order to come in and work. So there will be two strands. One is the major focus, negotiating with the EU to try and get a better deal, but Boris Johnson just said if in the end the EU doesn't play ball, he's ready for a no deal, and I got the very clear impression that they are preparing to blame the EU if we can't get a deal. He's setting them up as the bad guys. But separate from all of that, lots of work on his domestic priorities. As I say, more money for schools. Importantly, he said there were 20 hospital renovation programs they were going to get to work on immediately. They want to get more money out of the back offices into the front line of the health service. He talked about more money, more policemen again. This was a big theme of his campaign. Now, what I was struck by, because plainly his advisors have told him that this is not the moment to do this, not that popular, there was very little talk of tax cuts. He talked about tax changes to help businesses invest, but as you'll remember, he made a controversial claim. His first claim during the election campaign was that he was going to lift the threshold at which richer people pay the 40% top rate of tax. No mention of that. So plainly, taxation changes on the back burner, improvement of public services now the priority.
All right, Robert, thank you very much for now. Kwasi, you were smiling throughout that speech. Will his foes within the Tory party, as well as his friends, welcome what he said there?
I think it was a very powerful speech. I think it was delivered with his customary energy. He likes his play with words. No backstop, but the buck stops here. That struck me. And he's an inventive, creative politician. And I think many people in the Conservative Party, I think the whole party actually, will rally around that. There are one or two people who have reservations, but broadly, I think people want to get behind the new Prime Minister and make sure that he delivers Brexit and continues in his bid to unite the country.
That's his big promise. He's also made a promise to fix the social care crisis. I mean, that's an incredibly big promise, isn't it? Because it's incredibly complicated how you bring those two organisations, social care and the NHS, together. He talked in the campaign about a cross-party approach. Will we see that?
Well, I think there'll be more details coming in the next few days. We don't know the composition of his cabinet. We don't know who the ministers will be who will be responsible.
Are you watching your
for
phone?
Those. Well, I've switched it off because I'm in the studio, but...
Good answer.
But I think that we've got to see the contours of the government, we've got to see who the people are before we can then think about driving the policies forward. But he's very clear that he's not going to simply forget about the domestic agenda while delivering Brexit. He's very focused on delivering the domestic agenda and on re-energising and taking the country forward.
OK, Kwasi, for now, thank you. Catherine, the speech, I was trying to check the time there. I think it was about 6 minutes. I'm sure somebody will clarify that in the next few minutes. I didn't think there were too many surprises. What did you think?
No, I agree, but I think the key to it was we were just talking about Theresa May's opening speech and how bold and ambitious that was. And therefore, when you look back on it, you know, it feels like she didn't achieve everything, certainly not everything, because Brexit was one of them, but she didn't achieve that sort of scale of ambition. He had actually a lot of specific pledges in there, certainly for what he wants to do you know, to hit the ground running and to get out and to start spending money. And that's the key. He hasn't got a chancellor yet, but he's already sort of allocating money that he wants to spend on these hospital upgrades, on the new police and so forth. So there was a lot of specificity there. Still quite a lot where it was sort of bold, ambitious, you know, his vision for Brexit, and a very strong sort of push there on that the tone must change, that we must now be positive, certainly his government, in the way in which they're talking about Brexit and how much, you know, that can do for the country. And that's going to be the key difference, I think, of how that tone changes in the way in which he wants his government to talk about Brexit.
Absolutely, and on the spending, you better pick a chancellor who is willing to spend in the way that he has just promised the country, though. We're going to take a break now, but our special coverage will resume in just a few minutes' time. I hope to see you then. Bye-bye. Welcome back. Prime Minister Johnson is now inside number 10 Downing Street in the next few minutes, and of course the hours ahead, beginning to start the process of forming his government. A few minutes ago, before he walked through the famous door, Mr Johnson called for Britain to look to its globalising past.
And after 3 years of unfounded self-doubt it is time to change the record, to recover our natural and historic role as an enterprising, outward-looking and truly global Britain, generous in temper and engaged with the world. No one in the last few centuries has succeeded in betting against the pluck and nerve and ambition of this country. They will not succeed today. We, in this government, will work flat out to give this country the leadership it deserves. And that work begins now. Thank you very much.
Of course, so much of his premiership will be judged on what Boris Johnson, Prime Minister Johnson, does over Brexit. Let's take you live straight to Brussels to get immediate reaction to that speech, to Boris Johnson's first moments in power from our Europe editor, James Mates. James.
Yeah, well, they knew this day was coming. I think it's fair to say they dreaded this day. One of the reasons that many people here tried to help Theresa May get her deal over the line is that they didn't want her to go because they knew what was coming afterwards. But it is the reality. Donald Tusk, the President of the Council, has sent him a letter today congratulating him, saying, I'm looking forward to meeting you to discuss in detail our cooperation. They will, of course, have listened to that speech. Most of it they won't have liked very much. One thing, let's start with the positive, that they will really have taken on board is the unequivocal promise to the 3 million EU citizens in the UK. This was something they always felt that Theresa May was never quite prepared to do, to make a unilateral statement like that about the 3 million, and Boris Johnson did that in his speech today, saying absolute certainty of their right to live and remain in the UK. The rest of it they won't have liked so much. This talk of preparing for no deal, the no ifs, no buts departure on October the 31st, the threat to withhold that £39 billion, the divorce payment. It would, said Boris Johnson, lubricate no deal. Well, they don't consider that to be part of the deal here. They think that is money that the UK owes for things like pensions for British civil servants who worked here and for projects that Britain committed to. They believe that is money owed, and if it is not paid in the event of no deal, then any of those sort of mini deals, managed no deal that a lot of people in London have talked about, you can be quite sure that if that money isn't paid, none of that will happen. It really will be, staring matches across the channel. The anti-democratic backstop, they won't have liked that sound. It was something that was agreed with the British Cabinet while Boris Johnson was a member of it. And also they will have noticed throughout that speech the way he's preparing the ground to blame Brussels for no deal if it happens. They clearly see that strategy coming from that speech today.
James Mates, thank you. Of course, what happens in the next few days in London very much will be watched by across the European Union and across the world as well. What I can bring you now is a second photograph of that meeting there that really marks the official start of the Premiership. A smile there from the Queen. Of course, we'll never know what exactly went on in that room between the two of them, what that conversation was about. But they're a smiling Queen, Her Majesty there, and Boris Johnson looking perhaps a tad more relaxed from the first photograph. Robert in Downing Street, there's the second photograph there of the two of them on this incredibly important day.
It is, and I'm actually reminded back in the 90s he was a working hack like me. I remember spending time with him actually at EU conferences, gossiping about colleagues, talking about what might be in store for us as we sort of grew up, as it were. And today I've just seen him walk into 10 Downing Street, picking up the sort of aura of being a Prime Minister. It is one of these really weird things that the moment you become Prime Minister, the sort of all the history and tradition and the respect that goes with the office just somehow becomes your sort of the clothes that you wear. An extraordinary moment in that sense, especially for those of us, as I say, who've known him for 25 years and knew him when he was just a hack like the rest of us. Very interesting what he had to say about Brexit. What it said to me is they're just going to go into overdrive immediately in respect of negotiations. Because the point is this, we can't get out on the 31st of October unless a judgment is made really within just a few weeks about whether or not we're likely to get a compromise from the EU that he would see, Boris Johnson would see as an acceptable deal, or whether, you know, we're going to have to go for a no deal. Because if we are going to have to go for a no deal, it's probably going to have to be a general election September or October. So not long for him to make that judgment between is a deal possible or whether we're going for a no deal Brexit.
Yeah, Robert Peston, after 3 years or so of political paralysis on this, the clock really is now ticking. Let's get more reaction to the speech and what Boris Johnson, Prime Minister Johnson, has said about Brexit and about how he intends to go forward from here with Libby Fina in Westminster. Libby.
Yes, well, joining me now are two prominent supporters of Boris Johnson, Nigel Evans and Anne-Marie Trevelyan. What did you make of his speech?
Well, I only heard the end bit of it, but it seemed to me that it was upbeat, that he was reaching out, and he wants to make a success of this job, not for himself, but for Britain. He actually believes in Britain, so it's very positive. And
he said he could get a deal. He sounded more upbeat about that no deal. He mentioned, said it was common sense to prepare, but I felt there was a bit of a shift.
That's no news there, Libby. He wants to leave the European Union with a deal. Brussels needs to play as well. If they keep saying, no, that's it, this is what's on the table, being defeated 3 times in Parliament, then there's not much of a negotiation that's going to take place. But I think Boris, they'll know with Boris that he believes in the mission.
Absolutely.
He wants to leave the European Union by October the 31st, and he wants to do it with a deal. And the deal is to the benefit of the European Union as well as to us. So it's a can-do philosophy, Libby, and he actually believes in the mission.
Can-do, Anne-Marie, but was it very different from what Theresa May has been saying for the last 3 years? We've got to prepare for no deal, but I'm going to get a deal. She was saying that, and she didn't get one.
Well, indeed, I mean, the words were similar, but actually the reality of the deal that she was putting together with the EU was not what I would call an actual Brexit. We remain tied in so many different ways, and in particular, obviously, with the Irish position in the backstop, which was unacceptable to large numbers of colleagues. But the reality was that it wasn't a deal that, for me, said we're leaving and we're going to have a new relationship with our European neighbours. And that's what we need to have.
So if you get a repackaged Theresa May deal, if Boris Johnson dresses it up, but essentially it's the same deal, you will vote it down?
Well, you know, I look forward to what they can come up with. I think, for me, one of the things that frustrated me most was the sense of supplication that went on with Theresa May. It was always us going to Brussels, her going to sort of beg for a little bit of this, a little bit of that, in the same way that when David Cameron, before the referendum, and was perhaps hoping that, you know, he could find a solution that meant he didn't have to ask the country for their view, this sense of, please, sir, can we have a little bit more? And actually, that isn't the relationship the United Kingdom, the 5th largest economy, should have with our European neighbours. The EU is a project.
So she's failed
which is
because
fine.
she didn't try hard enough.
Well, I always had a sense that she didn't, you know, believe in Brexit in the same way that I think those 17.4 million people, and indeed many more, certainly in the North East, even people who voted Remain, have said to me, since my word, we've watched the EU, they just don't get us. I'm like, no, you know, they haven't. That's okay. They don't have to get us. I don't have to go with this line of bullying and all that sort of stuff. You know, the EU project is a particular project which, if it has merit for those countries, I'm very happy for them to carry on with it. But I don't want to be part of a single state of Europe. It's very simple.
Nigel Evans, very briefly, there were protests in the Mall. We've never seen that before.
No.
He is a controversial figure. You have taken quite a chance with him, haven't you?
Oh, no, we haven't taken a chance at all. What we do know from the European Union election results and the local election results is we got hammered in both, and that unless we changed the leadership, we were going to be hammered at the next general election.
But the Liberal Democrats did very well as the Brexit Party. How are you going to solve that dilemma?
Well, the Brexit Party were the clear winners of the European Union elections, and I believe that once we've left on October the 31st, and we're both looking forward to the 1st of November, then it's a game changer. We can start to focus on the domestic agenda.
Thanks, Nigel. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we have to go back to the studio.
Problem.
Nigel and Anne-Marie, thank you very much indeed. And now back to you, Nina.
Libby, thank you. Let's strip everything back on Brexit. This is all about the backstop. This is fantasy politics, talking about getting rid of it, surely.
I don't think it's fantasy politics at all. I said earlier in the programme that last year the EU said categorically they would not look at alternative arrangements. That's technological arrangements on the backstop,
so why would they
on the
now?
border. They themselves have said earlier this year that they were willing to look at that. They've compromised on that. They are flexible, pragmatic people. They want to see a deal. And I don't have the pessimism that a lot of people in our media have regarding the negotiation.
Very briefly, President Trump talking directly to Nigel Farage at an event in Washington yesterday, talking about how Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage will work together. What does he know that we don't?
I don't think Donald Trump's knowledge of British politics is that extensive. I was told that he thinks that Nigel Farage and Boris are in the same party. I don't know whether that's true, but I wouldn't follow his remarks and use them as gospel in terms of...
Boris Johnson like that comparison of being Britain Trump?
Boris, as Prime Minister, will want to work as effectively and as closely as he can with the President of the United States, whoever that person may be.
Catherine, we've got about a minute. I want your predictions for the Cabinet. What trumps what? Is it diversity? Is it experience, loyalty, Brexit, Remain? What's the most important factor when he forms this Cabinet of modern Britain?
I think it's going to be Brexit versus Remain, but I don't think there's going to be many who are Remain at this stage. I think everyone's going to be 100% Brexit. It's what he's asked for. I think experience is going to be important, but actually I think beyond those appointments, the key thing is going to be where does the Prime Minister go in the next week, in the next 2 weeks? Who does he go to visit around the country, around Europe particularly, possibly around the world? That's going to be what we're going to be looking for.
What's your prediction for that?
It's whether he goes to Germany, France first, whether he goes to the US. I think he will make some visits. He's already trailed. He makes some visits around the country. Theresa May went to Scotland within 48 hours. These are going to be the strong signals
and
that he
makes
sends
those
out.
first phone calls to Catherine Haddon. Thank you, Kwasi Kwarteng. Thank you very much. Let's go back to Downing Street for a final time and get a final thought from Robert Peston. Robert.
So Boris Johnson's great adventure begins now. Some of his colleagues think he could be the shortest Prime Minister in history. Others think he is the man who can deliver them a genuine, workable majority after a general election. What is clear is we are in for some of the most tumultuous months in politics that we've ever seen because of his pledge to get us out of the EU on the 31st of October. Now that means that he has to prepare the UK for a no-deal Brexit, just in case. Many would say in the very likely case that he doesn't get a compromise deal out of the EU. Perhaps the quote of the day was, "Never mind the backstop, the buck stops with me." The backstop, that controversial element of our withdrawal agreement, he's tearing up, which means many people say he won't get a deal out of the EU. If he goes for no deal, there will be the mother of all battles with Parliament. The Labour Party opposed to it, at least 30 of his own MPs opposed to it. So my prediction is that we will continue to talk about the likelihood of a general election. It could well take place in October over this crucial issue of whether we leave on that due date of the 31st of October. Sadly for you, Nina, the British people, you're going to be hearing a lot more from me over the coming weeks and months.
Robert Peston, thank you very much. As Robert was saying there, the Boris Johnson era has begun. Prime Minister Johnson has been clapped into Downing Street. His coronation is now complete. The boy who wanted to be world king has got his dream job. Will he live to regret it, or will he energise the country as he has now promised? His top team being formed as we speak. The analysis of his choices in cabinet and beyond will continue throughout the rest of the week and his premiership. There will, of course, be more on all of that on our website, continuing coverage on itv.com/news, and more on ITV a little later with Mary at Downing Street at 6:30. But that is all from us for now. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.